And we've got two gentlemen here who have been deeply involved with the development of that. The first speaker, and it's sort of a tag team that we're going to have here this morning, is Patrick Mullen. He's the Water and Sanitation Specialist for IFC, the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector investment arm of the World Bank Group. IFC has been actively investing in global water sectors for over 20 years. Patrick is a senior civil environmental engineer with over 20 years technical and managerial experience in the international water and sanitation business. His international experience includes 15 years of work in the Middle East, Africa, Europe, Caribbean, Asia, Latin America, and as I found out this morning, through the sewers of Milwaukee as well, tracing back his time. So he's literally been all over. He will also be joined by Lee Adams. He is the engagement manager and practice expert in McKinsey & Company's sustainability and resource productivity practice based out of New Jersey as well as Washington, D.C. He's part of the global leadership team for the firm's global water service line and serves public sector and private sector clients globally, again, United States, Mexico, and India. Prior to joining McKinsey, Lee led research at the intersection of sustainable development, water resources, and climate. He has also worked as a geophysicist at Exxon. Most significantly, and I think we kind of call this is the McKinsey report, or the Prince of Orange, and I'll let sort of Rich describe his whole connection with the Prince of Orange. But a very, very significant report that came to light to our attention. And I have to give credit to where it's due to be help us. Laurent Auguste from Veolia Water was able to help us to be able to get Lee here and Patrick, as well as this afternoon with Dennis Dimick. So, Laurent, thank you very much for really all of your assistance picking up that phone. So what they're going to be talking about is the Prince of Orange, William, who is the chairman of the United Nations Secretary General's Advisory Board on Water and Sustainability. Lee co-authored that publication, Charting Our Water Future. Patrick?
I'm very happy to be back in Milwaukee. My first job as a water engineer was with a company based in Chicago. One morning, a pickup truck was driving down the road somewhere here in Milwaukee, and one of your 100-year-old 10-foot diameter brick sewers collapsed and swallowed the pickup truck. So we were called in on an emergency contract to inspect the sewers, and I got my first job as a project engineer with rubber boots that come up about this high, wading through fortunately, the combined sewers of Milwaukee and not pure sanitary sewers. So that was my experience. I'm happy to be back in Milwaukee to see the aesthetically beautiful top side of the city this time. Needless to say, I'm very, very pleased that Milwaukee has become a hub and a center of excellence for water, and is able to add water to its repertoire of other resources that it is renowned for. I believe the Milwaukee Water Council has recognized water as a key resource, both in terms of addressing its increasing scarcity and quality issues, as well as its potential for enhancing economic growth. Water's true economic value is increasingly being recognized and attracting both the public and private investment, which reflects its true value. Now, as a water specialist, I've always said that one day water will be, and the specialists who deal with it will be economically valued, and hopefully as much as petroleum engineers in the future. This year for Father's Day, my 3 sons gave me a little present. It was a clay jug with a little cork top on it. On the side, it's marked the Harley Fund. So I'm hoping that someday I'll be able to fill the Harley Fund, because water will be recognized as an economic value. In 2008, a unique public-private partnership emerged to contribute new insights in the increasingly critical issue of water resource scarcity. The partnership is known as the Water Resources Group, and it was formed out of a range of organizations, both in the private and social sectors, which provided the institutional collaboration and counsel needed to tackle this complex issue. Initiating sponsorship for the project came through the International Finance Corporation. And the World Bank, which the IFC is part of, provided substantial input and resources from its experience in the water sector. The World Bank and IFC have been active, as Dean mentioned, for many, many years in the international water sector, both on the public and private side of the equation. McKinsey & Company, a global management consulting firm that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, and provided the overall project management, drove the analytical execution, and developed the fact base for the report. And Lee will be telling you more about that going forward. An extended business consortium was formed along with IFC and McKinsey and became known as the Water Resources Group, and has supported the study and the follow-on work which came after the study. The main aim of this report, actually there were three key issues it was trying to address. One, the need to focus on ways to close the global water scarcity supply-demand gap, and the focus was on doing that by the year 2030. Secondly, the need to focus on economically rational water resource decision-making. Thirdly, the need for public and private partnership in the effort to close that gap. So the result of this seminal effort is the report that you have in front of you, which Lee will present, Charting Our Water Future. It was publicly launched in November of last year. The report is unique in that it's the first time that the water sector has had an analytic tool for fact-based economical evaluation of a full spectrum potential means for closing that water supply-demand gap. This tool is known as the water cost curve, and I'll hand it over now to Lee to explain to you how that works. Thank you.
Pleasure to be here today. I had a little some travel snafus in getting here. I got here in the wee hours of the morning, but I'm certainly glad that I made it for the beginning of the session. It's amazing to feel the energy behind this effort here. I'm truly overwhelmed by it. Thanks to Dean for the organizational help on it, and Rich and Paul. I mean, what you organized here is truly world class. As Patrick mentioned, we do have interest in helping support resource productivity in general and in water. And these sorts of efforts, I think, really, where you see the private sector and the public sector engaging with the academic community and the experts is see 120 seeing people like The Economist, and I noted this as well before it was called out this morning. Places like Milwaukee are not only pointing out that water must support growth, but also can be an engine for catalyzing growth, both in technology. And again, just seeing the key ingredients here and the groundswell of support for these sorts of private and public sector initiatives. Not only in the traditional sense of the partnerships on projects, but in these initiatives that really help move the thinking, right, and move how economic development fits well with resource management. Truly impressive. So as Patrick mentioned, in a unique partnership that McKinsey was involved with, we brought a few of these reports. It is certainly not the McKinsey report. It was done in partnership with the IFC and a few other groups. But I think hopefully relevant to the things you're trying to do here. Your challenge is certainly great on how to galvanize these coalitions. In the same spirit, we went about this effort, right? And maybe before we get into that too much, I know I have a brief video clip that shows some of the leaders that are reflecting on the importance of water at the global stage, some of which were involved in this effort. I think the important thing is that, you know, it's trying not to be siloed with this. It's involved leaders and figures from all different sectors and all different stakeholder groups. So if that's okay, let's just run this quick clip, if that's all right.
Water is so important for all aspects of economic and social development.
It is absolutely crucial to our growth and sustainability.
It's also the most important individual factor for the sustainability of human life.
You can live without television, without a car, without a bicycle, without extra clothes. You can't live without water.
Yet, society is currently using one of our most precious resources on the planet unsustainably. There are limits to what our natural systems can provide, and the strains are beginning to show.
The water issue is starting to impact people right now.
We're increasingly getting periods of drought and drought stress on plants all around the world.
In Australia, the amount of water available for use is now 30% of what it was 10 years ago.
In California, a lot of the farmers have simply not been able to get the water that they need to grow the crops that historically they've grown.
London, for example, has had to consider a desalination plant to cover peaks. Atlanta is shutting down power plants during the hot summers.
There are clear and visible signs of stress now, but what will the picture look like in 20 years if we do not take concerted action?
There will be something like a 40% gap between supply and demand on a global scale by 2030.
Nobody says solving the water challenge will be easy, but what are the major barriers ahead? How will we overcome them to unlock new and existing solutions?
The challenge of protecting water resources and using them responsibly is important yet extremely complicated.
Demands placed on the system are unique to each country. It is estimated that without efficiency gains in 2030, 80% of India's total water demand will come from agriculture. In contrast, China's water gap will be driven by the doubling of water demands from both industrial and power generation, as well as an urbanizing middle class. It will take a mix of innovation of new and existing technologies and techniques combined with smart policies.
The key thing is that governments have to have the right amount of data and the right quality of data to be able to start making those decisions on the right framework to implement. If they haven't got the right data, they're guessing.
The public sector and the private sector has to work together. So I think it's not an either or, it's having both.
Everybody has a place at this table because the challenge is huge, and simply we need everybody to be involved.
Although difficult, we needn't face a water crisis. The water gap can be closed sustainably and at a reasonable cost.
I do think it's solvable, but we have to act now.
So it is possible, but it requires a different kind of thinking and a different kind of momentum.
With the right technologies, the right financial structure, and a keen focus on conservation and efficiency, we can reverse the course and alleviate water stresses throughout the world.
Together, we must work to solve the water challenge. Our future depends on it.
All right, great. Thanks for letting us reuse some of this material from our launch. I think it's compelling to see, global leaders make these sorts of statements, right? When you see a much more nuanced way of speaking about water come across some of these global leaders, we hear it in boardrooms now. I mean, it's evidence to me that the trend is in the right direction. I think so. Today, while hoping this is certainly relevant to the issues that you're tackling here, I'd like to focus on a few points. First of all, as a theme in my remarks, I want to just highlight the importance of a fact-based approach, right? A fact base that's transparent, that's clear, that leads people to action, and that all can kind of focus on. But certainly this is not the first time that anybody has put together facts on the water issue. And so what is really important is that it is elevated and that it has the right leadership engaged on the issue, right? Water is such a complex field. Dr. Wilkinson brought in many of these complexities the nexus with energy. Additionally, the nexus with land use, the nexus with economic development, right? So it's enormously complex, and we need to have this leadership to help us focus on the issues and actually make progress. And then my third theme will be that it is a complex issue, but there are solutions. We have solutions available. We have the innovation that helps make those solutions cheaper, more applicable, and have better business models around them to deploy them. So in my remarks today, the effort that we focused on was of all these universe of water issues, we focused on what is almost an existential issue for many countries, and that is just sheer water availability to drive agriculture, to drive to support cities and to support industry. So we didn't look at the entire universe of quality issues, but focused on this water availability gap. So the 4 points is that truly there is a massive water resource challenge out there. It can be expressed in terms of a gap. The second message is that business as usual, as much as we would like it to, won't solve this problem. Right? We can't. The future cannot be the past. The third point is that there is a cost-effective solution out there. It cannot be siloed. I've heard this language earlier today. It cannot be siloed in just agriculture and just municipal use and just industrial use, but it has to involve all of these, and it has to involve the public sector and the private sector and civil society in these solutions. And at the end, maybe just a couple thoughts on what this sort of a transformation might look like. So first of all, to talk about the resource challenge and growing water scarcity. It's certainly a topic that lends itself well to National Geographic, who will be speaking later today. The images, right? And let me just go through a few of these, right? Often we see that the Yellow River, a big sustaining force for China, on occasion does not reach the sea, right? They've certainly got quality concerns along the length and the breadth of that river system. Other images right here in the U.S., the arid Southwest. The Colorado has increased salinity problems and often has had detrimental environmental effects in the delta going into the Sea of California. You see the Aral Sea region in Central Asia. Again, the environmental effects of increased abstractions upstream for agricultural use and hydropower are having their effects. We're seeing some improvements in that with good management, but the impacts are noted. Same could be said for wetlands, especially an issue in this country. How water quality and water availability and land use all interact. This example is from, of course, the Iraq wetlands. So what needs to happen? I think countries, and you could say the same thing for regional and municipal governments, are realizing they need to accelerate their progress towards water security. So you have multiple pressures. Population growth is increasing demand for water at multiple scales, right? That can be the food demand, certainly just sustaining the cities and municipal and domestic use. You have economic sectors that are increasingly dependent on having reliable water supplies. I mentioned the agricultural sector, but also industry, right? And they require different qualities and different reliabilities, of course. But that connection is undisputed. The increasing infrastructure costs, if you want to take a supply side only perspective, and Dr. Wilkinson brought this out quite clearly, that the marginal cost of increasing supply from distant areas is increasing massively as those kind of easy, low-hanging fruit have disappeared. There's a need to improve our environmental standards, and a lot of that is related to water availability, how we manage that. And then there's increased climate variability that's associated with potential climate change, and how that affects not only the supply side, but also the demand side of water. And so you see this increased need and even leadership on focusing on accelerating progress towards water security. So what sorts of efforts do we see out there? Well, we see new modes of engagement by the private sector and by others. If you attend or are aware of the World Economic Forum, it's full of celebrities, but also private sector and public sector leaders. They start to comment on water. And this has happened for the last few years. There's been calls for, we need more insights, we need more fact-based foundations. And I think it's a little bit more of taking what is already known and being able to elevate that to the right issue. The Water Resources Group is one effort that is trying to develop new insights, or at least make them understandable in a way that allows that leadership to happen. And then I think the next generation will be a new engagement that supports local transformative efforts, and I think certainly this effort here is one of those. And Patrick will mention a little bit more about that at the end. So I guess just a quick comment. It's enormously complex, the water sector. As I mentioned, there's political economy issues and there's governance issues. We didn't address all that, right? So there's lots of policies out there, proposed policies that probably need to happen. Our effort was more on just the technical and the economic component, right? What are the technical measures that are out there to help reduce that the growing water gap, and what are the investment economics behind it? And can those be a good starting point for addressing some of those thornier policy issues? So just a quick caveat. As Patrick mentioned, this report was released in November. Had the participation of the World Bank Group, who was very interested in helping drive improvement in the water sector globally, especially in the least developed countries. President Robert Zoellick was part of it. Overall, a very successful outreach. But again, the report is not the end of itself, but hope to catalyze efforts such as this, actually. So let me just reflect a little bit on the analytics that we did. So what will drive a future water gap? Well, first of all, if you look at today's existing withdrawals, this is not consumption, but actually the water that is extracted for the different uses, you come out with about 4,500 cubic kilometers. And this is is obviously on a global scale, but we did the analysis aggregated over about 150 different basins or regions in the world. What does that look like going up to 2030? Well, unconstrained, meaning if there's no improvements in efficiency or productivity over the time frame to 2030, that will grow at about 2% a year to about 6,900 billion cubic meters per year. But what to compare this against? So if this increasing demand will be out there, these increased water requirements, can we just meet the challenge? Do we have that sort of water available? And the answer is no. So if you look at something to compare it to, we can look at what is currently available in terms of water resources to meet those, those extractive demands. You can get it from groundwater or from surface water. And the key thing is here I want to point out is what we're looking at is not, it's certainly not the raw resource that's in the river. It's certainly not what falls from the sky. The important thing to compare against is what is accessible, meaning it's near a demand center, or it can be moved to a demand center, that it's reliable. Water naturally varies over years and time frames of days to years. What's important is that you have a reliable supply to match against those demands. And the third one is that it's sustainable. So if you are currently supplying a certain amount of water to an agricultural region, it's in excess of what can be sustained by aquifers or the natural systems. You shouldn't count all that as your supply. You should reduce it by some amount. So that's the existing accessible, reliable, sustainable supply. So if you look at this and you compare it across all these basins globally, it turns out that you have approximately a 40% gap, and that is the size of the challenge. That is the size of the adjustments you'll have to make, either technically or otherwise, to be able to rectify what you would like to achieve economically, socially on the demand side, and what you're able to provide sustainably. So if that kind of sets up the challenge, we know for sure that water is an extremely local issue, right? So if this is an aggregate picture, what does that gap look like? This 40% gap look like if you go region by region? So as part of the analytics, we did look across about 150 regions, including large countries such as China and India. And you could see that if you look out to the future, so on the x-axis here is 100% of the world population in 2030. On the y-axis is the gap. So any bar underneath the gap is an area that will be in deficit unless action is taken. And as you see, about 90% of the world's population will be under these conditions of extremely constrained economic conditions because of water availability. If you do a little bit of, so even within countries obviously as large as China and India, there's enormous geographical availability in terms of water, the raw resource availability, but also in terms of the infrastructure that's there. For example, you see Ethiopia that's kind of on the right side of that. It's got a gap of over 90%. Anyone that's traveled to Ethiopia or looked at it on a map, you can tell it's the water tower for Africa, essentially. It has enormous water resources. But the infrastructure that it currently has to make use of that is quite small. So if it wants to grow agriculturally as it hopes to, they're faced with that large gap. So it doesn't depend on just the natural resource conditions. If you do kind of a double click on China and India, which were two of our case studies, you also see that gap varies significantly throughout the country. So let me just pause there for 1 second. So geography matters, but even more important is political will and having the ability, the infrastructure to make that water available. So let's do a little quick look at India. So if you look geographically, the color here is in relation to the size of the gap in 2030. So broadly, most of the country is underwater, as they would say, and it has a significant water gap looking ahead to 2030. But what's driving that? In India, and I'm going to look at India and I'm going to look at China just briefly and contrast them. So in India, it turns out that to be able to sustain a growing population at current yields and current productivity in both agriculture and in industry, but especially in agriculture, that demand is going to increase substantially over time, those water requirements. If you believe what they say they want to grow, it's grains, it's rice, it's wheat, other crops, those have substantial water requirements. And if you look at the effect of that, by the time you get out to 2030, the 1,200 billion cubic meters is essentially how much the Indian government says is available, ultimately available for the entire country. Right? So you're looking at a train wreck between agriculture and infrastructure here, if nothing is done. Look at China, it's a slightly different story. So again, it's got some regions that are more, that have a water gap that's more impending than others. But throughout the country, you have this water challenge. What's driving this water gap in the basins of China? Well, certainly it's growing agriculture, but agriculture also has a fair amount of productivity gains already locked in. Instead, the key driver of the gap in China is industry, and that's growing along with municipal use at about 3% a year at least. And so, interesting as we compare India and China, the solutions, the least cost solutions, will also mirror those the drivers of demand. So, what are the consequences? I think I'll just go briefly through this in interest of time. As well known, we read The Economist, we read other news sources. We're already facing the economic consequences of water scarcity. You see some of these, and this is just a quick survey over the last decade. In China, there's new regulatory measures on extremely water-intensive businesses. In China, it actually has reduced industrial production in some regions where there's been short-term water availability challenge. Places that are more isolated, we mentioned Singapore earlier on, are increasingly vulnerable. Taiwan is another example. The semiconductor industry is very sensitive to water availability. See it in the U.S. As you see images of dry reservoirs, that naturally gets people thinking a lot about the economic challenges of water scarcity, and there's others. Maybe worth pointing out just one in India that keeps coming up, where PepsiCo and Coca-Cola were invited to depart a certain region because of the perception of extensive withdrawals that were affecting local supplies, right? I guess the question is, with all this, with this gap that we see, with the challenges of meeting water requirements in the future, will the problem take care of itself? We're not here talking about water as if it was the first time anyone's ever thought about it in this. We've been dealing with water issues for many thousands of years, right? And in particular in development, and international development, it's been a focus for the last 50 or 60 years. As Dr. Wilkins pointed out, but a lot has happened in the last 50 years, but how much progress have we made in the water sector? And can that progress that we have seen sustain us as we look towards 2030? And the initial analysis is that no, we will have to take even greater efforts in the future. So if we take the idea of this water gap and look at a water gap that exists today, and there is a water gap today because we are overexploiting water in many places. And if we grow that out to 2030, if we have this demand with no productivity improvements on the top and the existing supply that we have on the bottom, what could happen in the future? Well, if we increase supply infrastructure, smart supply infrastructure at historical rates, that may give us a little chunk of that, maybe 20% of that gap. We've historically improved productivity substantially over time, but how much will that get us of the gap? Maybe another 20% if yields continue to improve at historical rates, as well as industrial productivity. So what are we left with? We're left with at least a 60% remaining gap. And what does this tell us? This tells us that simply the future cannot be the past. We cannot just rely on business as usual. Now, I took a slide out here, but I think it's worth just mentioning some of the insights. We look at labor productivity in the U.S., say over a 150-year period up from 1830 to about 1950, 1960. You saw about a 10x improvement in labor productivity. What do you have to do in terms of carbon productivity if you want to decarbonize the economy? Well, it's essentially a 10x improvement in productivity that we'll have to see in a very much shorter time, maybe 40 years. And if you look at water, we've actually done a quick analysis, and if you had to meet this entire gap through water productivity gains, you're looking at essentially a 10x increase in water productivity in a slightly longer time frame, perhaps. Over the space of about 50 years. Yeah, so it's a substantial amount if we want to do it just through productivity, and we will have to do a lot of it through productivity. So that's another way to kind of think about the size of that challenge. So in the spirit of, of sort of reducing complexity, taking an issue that is very complex and trying to look at least technical solutions, we found that there is a cost-effective solution out there, but it does require these economy-wide actions. Now, I mentioned trying to simplify this, and I'm well aware that what I'm about to show may not be an oversimplification. And so bear with me as I kind of explain one of the frameworks that we used. We used something that we would describe as a water availability cost curve. Is there a way to compare apples to apples? And I think Dr. Wilkinson did this very ably on what you can do on the efficiency side and what you may do on a supply side. We went with the hypothesis that you could do this. You could compare these things in an apples-to-apples way. And they should both try to give you incremental water availability. So as you move along this graph, each of the blocks will be a measure that gives you increased water availability. And two key things just to point out, I'll refer to this in a slide on India in just a minute. The width of this block quantifies the net impact on water availability. And I say net impact because it's quite important. If you reduce your withdrawals from a system, say in agriculture, you may be also reducing the waste that you had that another user was making economic use of. Same thing if you do water efficiency measures. In many cases, supply for downstream agriculture is already some of the waste or the waste streams that come out of municipal uses. So you just have to be careful and make sure that's the net impact. On the vertical axis, what we looked at is the actual economic impact, or sorry, not the economic impact, but the financial costs of that measure in terms of dollars per cubic meter. So even taking something as simple as increasing yields, what is the actual dollar impact in terms of dollars per cubic meter? Some of these measures, if they're below the line, actually have net financial savings over the lifetime of the measure, and the ones that are above the line will have positive costs. You can also lay against that just what's your water gap under a business as usual scenario, and then you can kind of pick and choose and see which one of these which of these measures would be the most optimal and which ones may cost the less. There may be other reasons to select them or deselect them, but at least it's a good framework and a good starting point. We hoped. So we did 4 different case studies, and the colors here correspond to the type of solution. So if the agricultural measures are in yellow, the dark green and the light green are industrial and municipal measures, such as water efficiency, such as leakage reduction, such as going to dry cooling and power supply. And then the blue ones are traditional supply measures, reservoirs, increased groundwater extraction, but also things like artificial recharge of groundwater that could potentially be a supply source. So I'll focus a little bit on India and on China, just because, well, they're large countries to start with, and because the nature of the solutions are different. So first, to go to India. We already looked at the gap that was driven largely by agricultural growth. If you look at the cost curve or the water availability curve for India, and this is aggregated, we did one of these at each of 19 different basins. You see that many of the measures on the left-hand side, and moving to the right, are these agricultural measures. Yeah? One key message is that if you overlay the gap that India has to 2030, it is solvable. You have technical measures, largely in agriculture, but also in supply measures, that can fill that gap. So it's not a hopeless scenario. So I expect all of you to read all of these measures in the short time I have on this slide. A lot of the details are in this report, of course. I guess the key point is that it was an exhaustive overview or cataloging of these measures. And they all have kind of an individual story for each one of them on the economics and on the availability, the actual potential that each one has. Let me just focus on 3 families. So I guess the first family would be traditional agricultural efficiency measures. And you may think drip irrigation, sprinkler irrigation, you may think, oh, that's a very low technology. Well, increasingly there's innovation, and some in this room are probably involved in the innovation in capturing these efficiency options. There's also new systems, intensifying rice production, for example, novel methods of just delivering water precisely to the roots and increasing yields at the same time. And unless you see, a lot of these yellow agricultural measures actually have reduced costs. They actually have financial savings. So we've taken, as Dr. Wilkins showed, the actual savings you would get not only in energy, which is the case for some of these agricultural measures, but also the fertilizer savings that you may have, the labor savings that you may have. And so it turns out a lot of these things on the left-hand side can save you all these inputs and save you water at the same time. So that's one family. Second family, if I'm going to get this right, is just simply agricultural measures that involve mostly productivity. So if you can do things like do better no-till farming, again, you save a lot of these inputs, you increase yield, and that reduces the need for you to go look for additional water supplies. So it is a water-saving measure. You could also add into this the more effective use of fertilizer that increases yields, managing stress to keep yields high in the face of climate variability. So again, another family of measures. And then, of course, you have traditional supply measures I mentioned previously. There's big plans for doing massive infrastructure in India. These are typically more expensive. There may be a reason to do some of them in terms of hydropower and that sort of thing. But there's also plenty of low-hanging fruit on the infrastructure side. You can maintain your infrastructure better. You can do artificial recharge and manage actively those groundwater resources. And these things, they do have a cost, and it's interesting to compare those against some of the productivity challenges out there. So if those are some measures for India, again, it's not trying to prescribe a set of measures, but rather have a map of all the things that are available to you and build a fact base around those, an economic fact base around it. What happens when we go to China? As I mentioned just previously, the actual nature of the gap differs substantially in China. Much more of that gap is driven by industrial growth. And so you see many industrial measures are part of the least cost solution. And if you look on the left-hand side, and again, I'm not going to go through each one of them, but that gap, there are measures to fill that gap. And a lot of these things on the left-hand side are industrial. They save energy. Yeah, and we've done some calculations, and all those measures, and they go from pulp and paper factories to energy production to other industrial sectors. If you add all those up in the municipal sector in terms of leakage reduction, if you add up all that energy and input savings, it adds up to a substantial amount. So you're looking at a $25 to $30 billion opportunity that's left on the table every year. Yeah? And so this should point to some of the low-hanging fruit. But now there's reasons why this isn't happening, and hopefully this sort of thing will provoke a greater look into those obstacles. But again, it's just a fact base on the table that the energy gains that you have, this energy-water nexus in China, is a substantial business opportunity. So if that's some of the solutions, again, that we see is possible, what next? Admittedly, it's not a policy roadmap. It's certainly not an investment roadmap. But it does point to ways, those measures there involve many different sectors, and certainly capturing those opportunities involves both the private sector and the public sector and civil society to work effectively together. We think that, again, returning back to one of my earlier comments, that a fact-based approach, making these facts very clear and transparent to leadership and to all stakeholders, is a very important part of what would be transforming the water sector. So having this accepted fact-based vision, both on the challenge and on the measures that are available to you, is quite important. But there's other elements that are required for a transformation of the water sector. Leadership and institutional arrangements. Right? We're evolving on those. We've evolved. We are evolving in the U.S. Slowly, I think. But we still have a long ways to go. The regulatory frameworks and the incentive designs need to be honed. The private sector needs to be mobilized in productive ways. Large users, and these would be agricultural users, industrial users, are part of the solution as well as part of the problem. And finally, technology, right? Technology and solutions development is certainly a part. So we've looked at existing technologies; those can be accelerated. Those can be, the cost of those measures can be driven down. New measures could come out that are cost effective and help look at both quality issues, energy issues, and water availability issues. So I offer that just as this is one contribution, hopefully, to that greater effort on transformation. Many institutions, and I'll just do this briefly and then hand it back to Patrick, are currently working on parts of this transformation process. There's diagnosing, planning transformative efforts, implementing, and then, of course, monitoring and following up. Several actors. Obviously, the public sector is active at several levels. Development agencies in the international world kind of have had their program. Donor agencies as well, especially on the international development scene. The private sector is having a growing impact on this transformative effort. And finally, civil society and NGOs, academic experts. And these groups need to work together, right, to make this a truly, with such a complex sector, need to work together to make this process happen. I think I'll just leave it there, other than we're seeing initiatives such as this in Milwaukee and other places on the global scale as well, that the private sector and others are taking a next generation look at engagement together in support of these transformative water efforts. So I think I'll leave it there. I'll be happy to take a few questions in a little while and look forward to chatting with you all individually, and I'll hand it back over to Patrick.
Thanks, Lee. And I think you can all see that this is a really transformative study in terms of really analyzing the economic value of water and looking for solutions that are based on economics and facts. Very similar, in fact, I was surprised to the presentation that Dr. Wilkinson did in terms of looking at water measures in terms of their energy efficiency. So, and there is a water energy nexus there to be explored. I just want to mention a few things that have been going on since the launching of the Charting Our Water Future report. One, IFC has committed, as a result of this study and development of our own strategy, to tripling our investment in the international water sector globally. And in fact, as a result of the water cost curves that Lee presented, we are focusing very much on water demand management, efficiency, and reuse. So very similar to the conclusions that Dr. Wilkinson arrived at. The Water Resources Group has now moved into a second phase of its life since the publication of the report. As Lee pointed out, there are many barriers in the institutional, legal, regulatory frameworks in many countries which are impeding further investment in water. Just as an example, one of the major barriers is subsidized water in the agricultural sector. The Water Resources Group is now moving forward to form itself to be able to effectively address these barriers internationally. And what I'd like to say is I think through effectively harnessing the outputs of this study, the Water Resources Group and other public and private partners really have an unprecedented opportunity to take a leadership position and enhance investment in the global water sector. The Water Resources Group has many partners as part of it. Veolia is a member. I would like to extend an invitation here to the Milwaukee Water Council and to other members of the audience to join us in this effort to transform the water sector internationally. Thank you.
Do people have questions at all for Lee and for Patrick at all? And we can go to those, hopefully. All right. Yes. Okay. If I could ask, there are some microphones, so we can record them, or if somebody could take a mic. The question all the way up there. You wouldn't.
What will be the impact of issues like corruption and lack of transparency in achieving these, in closing these gaps?
Take the hard balls.
I won't. I'll actually pass some of the hard balls to my colleague here who works on this in developing countries. I think it's certainly important to have, that was the purpose of the study, was to be more transparent with these facts. Again, we studied, we focused on the facts, and I think it's the challenges to the policymakers and to those who have knowledge on these subjects. Be it the private sector, the academics, others, to help increase that transparency. I mean, being able to have leadership like Senator Cole here today take these issues forward is something that's very much dependent on those actors, and it's an extremely complex sector. There's many actors, and they do need to work together to reduce the impacts of that intransparency. And you may say corruption, right? That just doesn't make for an efficient sector. Patrick, do you want to add?
Yeah, just to say that I think it's very important that institutions who are in the water sector, and the World Bank and IFC have absolutely no exceptions policy this way in terms of transparency. We will not, do not invest in, in any situations where there is any hint of malpractice, as you mentioned. So.
Please.
Lee, I was impressed with how the abatement curve for water, the array of actions, mirrors exactly what happens on the carbon emission side, where you tend to have the supply actions having large impacts but highly costly, demand reductions on the far left-hand side, and somewhere in the middle is your efficiency and distribution. Did you find, and because I know McKinsey's been involved on the carbon emissions side using that same tool, that there was any significant distinction between water and carbon emissions in the array of those actions?
There's a good question. So, in not only are there differences in the types of measures and what might incentivize them, but how does it parallel the carbon world? It's a good question. I think the comparison between water and carbon is certainly there. There are limits. I think the efforts of the cost curve was to put the facts on the table, not to dissect all the incentives that are behind, say, efficiency measures. That'll be the work of economists and those that will build on that. I think you have to realize the fact base is a starting point, right? There are complexities around the different measures that. You can compare them on an economic basis, apples to apples, but there are reasons that you might consider supply measures that go beyond just providing water availability. There's certainly downsides, right? There's environmental impacts of those measures. There are potentially upsides in terms of clean hydropower, managing damaging flood flows, for example, and those all have to be balanced, right? So you can't just say, oh, these things are more expensive, you shouldn't do them. But I think your point is that you have to examine the incentives that are behind some of these things. And again, I think the economic fact base is a good starting point to start to really get into those. So it's a good observation.
Just add a thought to that question, which is very interesting. What's really interesting about the water energy nexus is that, because unfortunately water is generally undervalued as a good, but energy is relatively highly valued. A lot of times, what makes possible effective investment in the water sector is the energy savings that result from water savings. So, as Dr. Wilkinson mentioned. So, for example, if you have a high leakage in a water distribution system, let's say 50%, for example, you're pumping twice as much water into that system as you really need for the distribution, which means energy costs associated with pumping. Reduce the leakage, reduce the energy costs, and sometimes that's the driver that's required to actually make it an effective financial solution, which will attract both public and private investment.
Dean?
I was curious if you've done a water cost curve for the Great Lakes region, the United States, or a water-rich area, particularly to get a sense of what might be those economically efficient measures that could and should be taken, notwithstanding whatever gap there may be, with some of the other ones that may involve some more significant costs.
Yeah. So the quick answer is no. We've focused on these developing countries that were and not in the U.S. Is it applicable? I think certainly yes. So you have different. We looked at a gap in terms of water availability to provide growth. There's ways of doing such a fact base that has the important quality metrics that you would need to use for an area like the Great Lakes with the Great Lakes Compact, and that's certainly important. I think what we found is this sort of approach has resonated significantly when you can see the economic basis of certain decisions you'll make. towards meeting a future goal. I think some of the graphs that Dr. Wilkinson put up on just the costs, the energy costs of providing some of these measures is another example of that. And hopefully these sorts of fact-based approaches can be applicable in areas other than the ones we looked at. Good. Well, it's a pleasure again to be here. I think it's fascinating to see what you're doing, and happy to chat more on the break.
I think what's interesting is in 1972, Henry Kissinger, trying to have one of his Kennedy moments, he was Secretary of State at the time, made a statement that by the end of the decade we would solve world hunger. And he made that statement because of the development of high-yield crops and the realization that high-yield crops could now generate more food than what we needed to support the population of the earth. It turned out he was wrong, and the reason he was wrong was because of distribution, poverty, and despotism, which prevented the food from getting to the people. But the fact is, as a globe, we are able to produce more food than we need, and we actually have a food surplus. The problem with the high-yield crops was that nobody focused on the fact that they were also more thirsty crops, and you actually get less crop per drop, as they say. And so over the last 30 years, that has aggravated our water problem in the world. I read the 2030 Water Resources Group. I might have been one of the people report. I might have been one of the people who actually read the whole damn thing. I think it's becoming like the Bible. It's the most quoted and least read book in the world. But I actually did read it, and one of the things that struck me as I went through this report, because it is a fascinating piece of work, and I, being a Dutchman, I take a little pride in the fact that Billy Orange put this thing together. You have to call him His Royal Highness the Prince of Orange. I could get to call him Billy Orange because I'm Dutch. And if he ever finds out I'm calling him that, I think I'm in a lot of trouble. So, but he put this together, and it is a great report, and it's an important report. But what struck me, and you couldn't read it because all of those technologies that are going to be needed to close the water gap in all these different places of the earth, they were very small, and there were a lot of them up there. But if you go through, I went through those lists of technologies, and I started checking off the technologies that are made by companies here in southeastern Wisconsin. And I found out that over 60% of the technologies that were listed are made by companies right here. That's what I think is exciting about that report. When you talk, what we basically have is McKinsey coming up here and saying, this is a major problem for the world. We know how to close the gap. We know how to solve the problem. It's just a matter of getting the technology out there and getting the solutions employed. And in this room are the companies and the scientists and the engineers and the talent that it's going to take to develop those technologies or bring those technologies to the world to close that gap. We have the need, we have the solution, and in between is the Milwaukee region and all of the skills that we have in this region to solve that problem. To me, that's what was the most exciting thing about that report. When we sit here and say, why is Milwaukee a world water hub? What opportunity does that represent? That list of technologies, page after page in that report, tells you exactly why we are in the right position at the right time, because the products we have here in Milwaukee, the talent we have here in Milwaukee, is absolutely needed by the world to close that water gap. That's what's exciting about it. So it was great to hear the McKinsey people talk about this and go through this report. I think it's very important for us to understand this is our roadmap. This is a technology roadmap for us to sit there and say, how do we take the companies and the assets we have in this region and grow them to help solve this problem?